Hello students, this is Dr. Ways and welcome to your lecture on the male reproductive system. The male reproductive system consists of internal reproductive organs as well as external reproductive organs. And so we'll start with a basic overview of what these are, beginning with the testes right here. All right, sperm is made in the testes as well as testosterone, male sex hormones, and that sperm will travel into the epididymis right here, and then the epididymis transports sperm into the vas deferens or ductus deferens, and that will exit the outside of the body, go through the inguinal canal, and become part of the internal reproductive organs. So here's the ductus deferens going up and around the urinary bladder, coming down to the backside where it will intersect with, not shown here, the seminal vesicles, which would be right about here. And then it travels through the prostate, and just before that it becomes the ejaculatory duct. And in the prostate, those ejaculatory ducts will meet up with the urethra coming from the bladder. So that will be this point right here. And then the urethra will continue and go into the spongy part known as the corpus spongiosum, and where it enters would be the bulb of it. And also at this part, the bulbal urethral glands will secrete their contents into the urethra, and then it will continue along through the spongy tissue of the penis until it reaches the external portion. So this is the second external. So it starts externally and ends externally. So finishing its course through the urethra in the corpus spongiosum and then out through the urethral orifice or urethral meatus to the outside of the body. So that's the general anatomy, going from the testes all the way through the external urethral orifice, and the path that sperm would flow along this route. Okay, but also notice that within here, we're including the urinary bladder. So this is genitourinary system. In this picture here, we see the urinary bladder. And what I want to point out here is a little more detail. We have the testes, the vas deferens going through the superficial inguinal ring, through the inguinal canal, through the deep inguinal ring. And remember, this isn't just going through alone, it's also going through with an artery and a vein. And then it will enter the pelvic cavity, go around, come to the back side where then it enlarges into an ampulla. And then right before it enters the prostate, you see these seminal vesicles here that are going to dump fluid into the ejaculatory ducts. You see where they merge right here within the prostate. And then at that point where they merge is also where they join the urethra. And so the urethra travels through the prostate, and we'll talk about the different parts of the urethra in the male. Goes into the bulb of the penis where the corpus spongiosum begins, and you see the bulbourethral gland right here. It's going to eject its contents into the urethra, and then again that's going to continue down around the shaft of the penis into the outside. Looking at the penis specifically, this is an inferior view of the pelvis of the male, and what you see here is the perineal membrane. So this is the bulb of the penis, all right, and this is also the bulb of the penis is where the corpus spongiosum starts, all right, and that's where it's actually attached to the pelvis. And within that, actually it's within the perineal pouch right here, not specifically those places, but the perineal pouch would be here. You have the bulbourethral glands, and you can see where they dump their contents into the urethra, and that would be the opening of the urethra going through the spongy part of the penis, or the corpus spongiosum rather. And then it continues out, and we've already talked about that through the external urethral orifice. The other part of the penis, which is on the dorsal surface, is the corpora cavernosa. So both of these, two of them on the dorsal surface, corpora cavernosa, which has a crust. And remember, we've seen that term crust before when we talked about the diaphragm. It's just two elongated parts of an anatomical structure. So this would be the crust of the penis, which is the starting point of the corpora cavernosa. And both the corpus spongiosum and the corpora cavernosa are the erectile tissues of the penis, and what engorge with blood and fill up. As we can see through this cross section of the penis, the dorsal surface has your corpora cavernosa, and the ventral surface has the corpus spongiosum, with the urethra going right through the middle of it. And what happens is, and we'll talk about this in physiology, when an erection occurs, blood will fill up these spaces and enlarge them, and that's what results in an erection. All right, and then at the end of the corpus spongiosum, we have the glans penis, which really is an extension of the corpus spongiosum. And of course, we know ultimately this is all encased in connective tissue with skin surrounding it. And so the only thing that you're missing here really that would be of importance is the prepuce, which is also known as the foreskin. And if a male is not circumcised, that would cover the glans penis, all right, and has to be retracted back during intercourse or during urination. Or if the male is circumcised, then it will be bunched in an area just posterior to the glans penis when in a flaccid state. This slide should look familiar to you as you've seen it before. These images show the pelvic arteries of the male. So starting with the internal iliac artery, we've already covered the superior vesical artery right here, which is going to the urinary bladder, as well as the inferior vesical artery, which is also going to the urinary bladder. And again, they're coming off the internal iliac artery, which again goes to the pelvis. Now what we want to be concerned with are those arteries that are supplying the reproductive organs with blood. And so one of the main arteries that do this is the internal pudendal artery. And here is the internal pudendal artery here coming around. Notice that it's behind that layer of muscle, or underneath that layer of muscle. And we'll talk about what those muscles are later on. And it's coming around, and it's going to the perineal membrane here, all right, where it will eventually become the dorsal artery of the penis. And when we talk about the dorsal artery of the penis, we're talking about these arteries here that are right on the dorsal side running along with corpora cavernosa. And the thing to remember about the dorsal artery of the penis is that it's going to supply the glans penis and the superficial tissues of the penis, as well as anastomosing with more deep arteries of the penis that you'll find within the corpora cavernosa. And if I didn't mention this already, the deep artery of the penis is also a branch of the internal pudendal artery, like the dorsal artery of the penis is. Other arteries of note include the artery of the bulb of the penis coming here within the perineal membrane, another artery of the bulb of the penis. And remember that bulb of the penis is within the perineal membrane, so or attached to the perineal membrane, so that's where you're going to expect to find those arteries. And then we have the perineal artery, which is going to branch and go to the posterior scrotal artery and surrounding tissues and skin. And this picture is just showing you in a little more detail your internal pudendal artery coming around right here, and notice it's going to the crus of the penis where the corpora cavernosa are going to begin. And at that point, it's going to branch into your deep artery of the penis and the dorsal artery of the penis. All right, and so this is just showing you right here again the dorsal artery of the penis and then the deep artery of the penis right here. And so this is going to wrap around to the dorsal side, which you see right here coming through with this cutout cross section. All right, as we suggested in the previous lecture about the urinary system, the male urethra is a more complicated structure than what you will find with the female urethra. And the reason for that is due to its connection to the reproductive system. So let's remind ourselves here that everything in blue here is going to be associated with the urinary system. So you have the bladder going down through the urethra, and then coming out through the internal part of the penis, through the external part of the penis, and out through the external urethral orifice, or otherwise known as external urethral meatus. All right. Now, as this urethra is traveling its length, where it's located determines the part of the urethra that it is, or the name of what it is, and its function. So first of all, we have the pre-prostatic part of the urethra, which is the part of the urethra that's just exiting the bladder right before it enters into the prostate gland. And so you notice that that is a very, very small part. In fact, it's really just the opening of the urethra from the bladder, because right away it's going to enter into the prostate. And what I want you to notice about this specifically is here is where, just as it's entering the prostate, here is where your internal urethral sphincter is located. And notice that that is smooth muscle. So what does that mean? That means that this is not under voluntary control. And when your bladder is full and that detrusor muscle starts contracting, that's going to signal this internal urethral sphincter to open, and urine is going to start to flow. Okay? And it's going to flow through the prostatic part of the urethra, which is next. All right? So the prostatic part of the urethra is a part of the urethra that's specifically flowing through the prostate. All right. So we're going to pause here and go to this picture right here, because well, for two reasons. One, we can see a little bit more clearly the internal urethral sphincter, that smooth muscle ring, and we see it goes all the way around the urethra, and will constrict to hold fluid into the bladder, but then when it relaxes, of course, it's going to allow urine to flow. And then with the prostate here, notice that the prostate surrounds the entire urethra and its glandular tissue, and as exocrine gland, exocrine. And remember, exocrine secretes substances into ducts or tubes, so you're going to have this duct system within the prostate that's going to have little openings within the urethra that would allow the contents of the prostate to enter into the urethra, almost like it almost looks like a colander or a little sieve within the urethra that's allowing, when given the signal, fluid to enter that portion. All right. After you exit the prostate, then you are going to enter into the third part of the urethra, which is the membranous part. And we call it the membranous part because it's going through the perineal membrane. All right, and the perineal membrane is this membrane that makes up the perineum, and it contains structures including muscles within that area, and we'll talk about that when we get to the pelvic floor. But of greater importance that I want you to know is that on the other side of the prostate is where we will have our external urethral sphincter. All right, our external urethral sphincter. Circle it here, and notice that that's made out of skeletal muscle. And what do we know about skeletal muscle? It is under voluntary control. So even though that bladder is pushing fluid through this internal sphincter that has been opened, you can consciously control that external urethral sphincter and hold the urine in until you have the opportunity to go to the bathroom. All right, so when children are potty training, what they're really doing is strengthening those connections between the central nervous system and this external urethral sphincter so that they can control when they urinate. All right. So after you get past the membranous part of the urethra, number 3, then you enter the last part of the urethra, which is the spongy part of the urethra. And it's called the spongy part because it's within spongy tissue, specifically the corpus spongiosum. All right, the corpus spongiosum. And it's at that point where you'll have openings for the contents of the bulbal urethral glands to secrete into. And then for the rest of the way, the urethra is going to travel within that spongy tissue, and that's why throughout the entire rest of the penis it's called the spongy part of the urethra, until it gets to the opening. Excuse me. Until it gets to the opening where the external urethral orifice, where the contents can be released. Now, if it's coming from the bladder, of course, it's going to be urine that's released. But if it's coming from the prostate, bulbal urethral glands, seminal vesicles, and testes, then it would be semen that's being ejaculated. And those are two completely separate processes that we'll talk about how they happen in physiology. All right. So the last thing I want to mention on this slide is that here would be the vas deferens coming down. They are connected to the seminal vesicles that are on either side of them, just superior to where the prostate is located. And it's at that point where the seminal vesicles and the vas deferens come together, where they become the ejaculatory ducts. All right, the ejaculatory ducts. Because now not only do you have sperm in there, but now you're going to have fluid from the seminal vesicle in there. And notice that they come down through the prostate and enter the urethra at this enlarged region right here, which is what you see in this picture. Let me turn the green here. This picture up top here. All right, that's where the openings to the ejaculatory ducts would be located. All right, and then they enter into the urethra through the external urethral sphincter and then out through the, they're calling it here the penile urethra, but also called the spongy part of the urethra. All right, the male urethra is about 20 centimeters long. And if you convert that, that's about almost 8 inches long. But keep in mind that that's going from the bladder all the way through the tip of the penis. So the only thing that this picture is adding right here is that the prostate itself is held in place by these puboprostatic ligaments. So it's not just as if it's floating there under the bladder. It is tightly held in place against the anterior pelvic wall and the perineal membrane. All right, so the testes. The testes are the structures in which sperm is made, of course, and what's also made in the testes is our male sex hormones, specifically testosterone. All right, so that's in the internal structure of the testes. Outside of the testes, you have a layer of connective tissue called the tunica vaginalis, and both males and females have this tunica vaginalis. We'll show where it comes into play with the females when we get to the female reproductive system. And as sperm are being formed, they will exit the testes and end up in the epididymis. And in the epididymis is where sperm mature and become motile, as well as acquiring the capacity to fertilize an egg. The epididymis will also store sperm until ejaculation can occur. So as sperm are as sperm are exiting the epididymis, they enter the head. Then they travel down through the body of the epididymis, which is the majority of the structure. And then they end up in the tail of the epididymis before they enter the ductus deferens or vas deferens. All right, and we notice the ductus deferens or vas deferens heads up in this direction to the superficial inguinal ring. But the point of this is not to talk about the flow of sperm. The point of this is to talk about the testes in the epididymis. So that's the general structure of the testes. Surrounding the tunica vaginalis, you will see the cremaster muscle right here. And remember, we mentioned the cremaster muscle before. It is responsible for raising or lowering the testes in response to temperature changes. But it will also respond to arousal, sexual arousal, as well as stroking of the inner thigh. In fact, this is one of the maneuvers that you will learn about in your physical exam lab. You won't be actually doing it, but you will learn about it in the physical exam lab, that when you stroke the inner thigh, a normal response should be that the cremaster muscle contracts and raises the testes up slightly on the same side where you touch the fly. And what that is a test of the integrity of T12, L1, and L2 spinal nerves coming out. And then finally, surrounding the testes, surrounding that cremaster muscle, would be the scrotum itself, or the scrotal sac, which is essentially a layer of skin that's continuous with the rest of the skin that is within the pelvic region of the body. And although it's not shown here, you only see one half of the scrotal sac with one testes in it. There is a septum, a fibrous septum, between each testes within the scrotal sac that separates the two testes from each other. All right, as for the microscopic structure of the testes, what you see here is internally here is the testes. These would be the coiled tubes, the seminiferous tubules, where the actual sperm is made. And between these tubes, this darker pink tissue is what we would refer to as interstitial cells. And the interstitial cells are where the hormones are produced. All right, so each set of seminiferous tubules are divided by septa, or walls, and those walls are made out of a capsule structure, fibrous capsule structure called the tunica albuginea. All right, so that's directly surrounding the entire testes, except where you have the ducts to the epididymis are leaving the testes. All right, so surrounding the tunica albuginea would be the tunica vaginalis, and that's this double-walled structure right here that you notice is surrounding the entire circumference of the testes, except for where the epididymis is. That's the only place where you where you will not find that tunica vaginalis. All right. So as sperm are made in the seminiferous tubules, they'll travel into this kind of network of tubes called the ready testes, and sperm will then go from there to the efferent ducts, and then they will enter the head of the epididymis. And notice that's a highly coiled structure, again, because the purpose of the epididymis is to make sperm motile and able to fertilize an egg. So This convoluted tube allows them to still move in a somewhat forward fashion, and give them time to mature along the way. And so then you'd have the body of the epididymis, and then the tail of the epididymis which would then connect directly to the ductus deferens. All right, blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics of the testes themselves. So keep in mind that we're coming from the femoral artery. All right, so this would be the femoral artery, and there's a branch coming off that called the anterior scrotal artery. So that would be part of the blood supply to the scrotum. The other part of the blood supply, remember, you have these gonadal arteries. In this case, they would be called testicular arteries, all the way up here between the superior mesenteric artery and the inferior mesenteric artery. So those come down. Here's the left side that will follow. The left side coming down, going directly to the testes here. So your left testicular artery. And it would be the same for the right side as well. As for venous drainage, generally that's going to follow the arteries, the same pathway, only going back towards the heart instead. And the same thing with lymphatics. If you notice, the lymphatics travel along with the testicular artery. They travel up the external iliac artery, common iliac artery, to the aorta, where they end up dumping into the cisterna chyli, which of course ends up dumping into the thoracic duct. And as far as nervous innervation goes, you have the testicular plexus on the right and the left. That's generally going to follow along with the testicular arteries. You have your posterior scrotal nerves, also known as posterior perineal nerves, as well as anterior scrotal nerves. And notice that those are coming from sacral regions of the spinal cord. All right, more about nerves. We have pelvic splanchnic nerves, sacral splanchnic nerves, and the hypogastric nerves coalescing, or all coming together to form the inferior hypogastric plexus. And you notice that the inferior hypogastric plexus will go to the distal rectum and anus, as well as to the prostate, which is going to form the prostatic plexus. That also has branches that innervate the penis as far as stimulating erection is concerned. For venous drainage of the penis as well as the prostate, you have this deep dorsal vein that goes along the penis, ends up the dorsal side of the penis between the corpora cavernosa, and joins this prostatic plexus of veins, which is just a collection that's draining a lot of different areas within the pelvic cavity. And then those are going to ultimately drain into the internal iliac vein, which will then go into the common iliac vein and then upwards towards the heart. Then the internal pudendal vein drains the perineal region and structures that are located there, and the median sacral vein drains structures along the sacrum back here. One more thing about lymphatics and lymph nodes in this section is that you have superficial inguinal lymph nodes and deep inguinal lymph nodes. And these are, especially the superficial, are sets of lymph nodes that have a pattern. You'll have a horizontal group of lymph nodes here, and then you'll have a vertical group of lymph nodes here that you should be able to find or at least palpate in a patient. You'll learn more about that when you get to your physical exam lab in the fall semester. So notice that these lymph nodes, these horizontal group of lymph nodes, travel along the inguinal ligament and that these vertical group of lymph nodes, they're also called femoral lymph nodes, are going to be a little more medial in the thigh. All right, and then those are going to drain external genitalia, the skin, more specifically the anal canal, as well as parts of the lower extremity. Then again, we see these lymph from the testes traveling up where the testicular arteries, along with the testicular arteries. We talked about that in a previous slide. And they are all going to end up going into the thoracic duct and then dumping back into the venous system to re-enter circulation.